Hello! In this video we're going to be making this friendship bracelet. We'll be learning two different patterns, this chevron here, and then this simple wrap style which we're going to put in the middle. We've also decorated our bracelet with a lovely button. We're using 4 different colours of stranded cotton or embroidery thread in our design. We want 2 strands of each colour, so we've got 8 strands in total. There's our button. It's also handy if you've got a paper clip, you can attach that to your skirt or your trousers to help you work. I'm going to be using my craft mat to keep this nice and close to the camera. So we start by gathering all of our 8 strands of stranded cotton together. So each of these is about 50 centimetres long. That's a good size for a child's bracelet. If you want to make one for an adult, just make it a bit longer. I'd say maybe 60 centimetres. So we're tying a knot at the top. So if you were working on this yourself, you could put your safety pin through that knot and then use that to pin to, if you're wearing jeans, it's quite handy to pin it onto your jeans on your leg so it's facing you. I'm going to just attach mine to my craft mat with this magnetic ruler to hold it in place. And I've put this white card here underneath the threads, so hopefully you'll be able to see nice and clearly what I'm doing without any of the pink craft mat colours getting in the way. So now we want to separate out our 8 strands of thread so that they match on either side. They're like a mirror image of each other. So we're going to start out, I've got the 2 yellow strands that I'm using. I'm going to have those on the outside to begin with. Then this more corally pink colour, separating those 2 out, and then in the middle we have a nice red. In my bracelet it's quite a vibrant red, and then leaving the 2 strands in the centre which are more of a sort of rusty brown in this colours that I'm working in. You can use any colours you like, and in fact if it's your first time making a bracelet, it's quite helpful if all the colours look quite different, because then you can keep track of the colours more easily. We're going to start from the outside colour in. So yellow is going to be the first colour on the edge of our bracelet. So I'm taking the yellow thread and wrapping it around the thread next to it. So you want to hold the next thread nice and taut. You can see how the knot is all in the yellow. And then I'm pulling that up the thread until it's up at the top. First time can be a little tricky for the first row. Once you've done one row, it gets much easier. So I'm repeating that again. So looping the yellow thread around, keeping the coral thread nice and taut and pulling that yellow knot up to the top. So each of the knots on our friendship bracelet is actually made out of 2 threads looped around the thread. So we're going to do it twice. We're moving on to our next thread along. For me, this was more of the vibrant red. So the yellow is the colour we want to be in the band. So we're looping the yellow thread around that, keeping the red thread nice and taut, and we're pulling it up, pushing the knot along until it's up at the top. So we've now done our 2 loops of thread around that colour. So we're going to move on to the next one. This is my rusty colour. Holding the rust thread nice and taut, loop the yellow round and then pull the yellow knot up to the end of the knot. And then we're going to do that one more time. Pull the yellow up, the yellow loops around. That's the one that we want on show, so you need to keep the thread you're wrapping around nice and taut. So because we're working the chevron, we're going to now move over to the other side. We've done our 4 threads on that side. So let's move over to the left-hand side of the bracelet, and we've got the yellow thread on the outside here as well. So I'm going to keep the coral thread nice and taut, and I'm wrapping the yellow thread around it, and then pulling the yellow loop up to the top of the bracelet. We'll do that one more time. So we're keeping the coral taut, pulling the yellow up. And you can see how the movement can become a lot more comfortable as you work. So let's move along to the next thread. This is the red one for me. Looping the yellow thread around, pulling the yellow thread up so it's at the top. We're going to do that one more time. The red thread stays nice and taut, the yellow thread loops around, and we pull the knot up to the top of the bracelet. So we've got one more thread to do on this side. It's the rusty one for me, which is held nice and taut. I loop the yellow thread around, pull the yellow knot up to the top of the bracelet. We'll do that one more time. We're doing 2 knots on each thread. And now both of the yellow threads, which started on the outside, are meeting in the middle. And so what we're going to do is just swap them over. This means that you get a nice join in your friendship bracelet. So we just swap the yellows so each one is now on the other side. And that is our first chevron done. So now we're going to do the second one. We're going to go back to the first right hand side. Now it's the coral thread that's on the outside. So we're holding the next thread, the red one, nice and taut. Wrap the coral thread around. Loop it through. Keeping the red thread taut, we're going to pull the coral loop up so it sits nice and close to the yellow knot we made last time. Do that one more time. We're doing 2 knots on each thread. And so now we've made both of our knots on the red thread. So we're going to move along. We're picking up the rusty thread and we're going to loop the coral thread around it, keeping the rusty thread nice and taut. We're going to pull that loop of coral thread and so it's sitting up next to the yellow knot we did in the last row. We'll do that one more time. And so now our last thread on this side, the 4th thread, is now the yellow thread because we left that in the middle. This is the one that we swapped from the other side last time. So I'm going to hold the yellow thread nice and taut, loop the coral thread around, pull the loop up to the top so that it's sitting next to the yellow knot at the end of the bracelet. And then we'll do that twice. So now we've got that coral thread left in the middle and we're going to go and work on the other side of the bracelet. So we're going to pick up the other coral thread and this time it's the red thread next to it. So we're going to keep the red thread nice and taut. We loop the coral thread around the red thread and pull the loop of coral thread up to the top of the bracelet. We'll do that one more time because we're doing 2 knots on each of the threads. The next one along on this side, it's the rusty thread. So we're holding the rusty thread nice and taut. We're going to loop the coral thread around it and pull the loop of coral thread up to the top so that it's sit next to the yellow knot at the top. We'll do that one more time on this side. And now the last thread in the middle on this side is the yellow thread. So we will loop the coral thread around the yellow thread, pull the loop of coral thread up, and then we do that one more time. And now we've got 2 coral threads in the middle. So just like on the last row, we just swap them over so that the coral thread sits on either side. And that helps make our chevron nice and joined at the top. Now it's time for us to make the 3rd row of our friendship bracelet chevron. So we're going to start on the right hand side again with the outside thread. This time it's the vibrant red for me. So I'm going to hold that 2nd thread nice and taut and wrap the red thread around it so that the loop of thread is in red, which I'm going to pull up to the top so it sits next to the coral knot. We'll do that one more time, exactly the same, because we're doing 2 knots on each of the threads. Now we're going to move along to the next thread on this side. That's the yellow for me. So I'm going to hold the yellow thread nice and taut. I'm looping the red thread around it so that the loop is in red, which I'm going to then pull up so that the loop of thread sits alongside the yellow knot. We'll do that one more time, exactly the same. So it's 2 loops on each thread. Now this is the last thread I'm going to loop around on this side. So I am holding the coral thread nice and taut and looping the red around it, and we're going to pull that up to the top. We're doing that twice. Now the red thread is left in the middle. That's this side done. We're going to move over to the left hand side of the bracelet, starting from the outside again. So the red thread, we're going to loop it around the 2nd thread, which I think is the rusty thread. Then we're going to pull that loop up to the top so that it sits in the friendship bracelet. We'll do it again one more time. So now we're going to move on to the 2nd thread. That's the yellow thread for me. I'm looping the red thread around it, pulling the knot up to the top. We'll do that one more time, looping the red thread around and pulling it up to the top. So there's one more thread to do on this side for me. I think that's the coral thread. We're looping the red thread around it, pulling the loop up to the top. We're doing it one more time because it's 2 loops on each side. So, oh, there we go. If I'd had that safety pin to my jeans, that wouldn't have come out. But I just obviously pulled a bit too taut there. But I've finished my knots on both sides. I'm going to swap those 2 red strands over, so each red is now on the other side. And then we can work our final row. This is in colour. This is the 4th colour in this friendship row. So for me, that's the rusty thread, which I've looped around the yellow, pulling the loop up to the top. We'll do it one more time because there's 2 loops on each thread. Pull the loop up to the top. So then we're going to move on to the 2nd thread on this side in this row. So we will wrap it round the coral thread, my first loop, keeping the coral thread nice and taut, looping the rusty thread around it and pulling the loop up to the top. We need to do one more loop on this because it's 2 loops on each thread. And then there's still one more thread to do on this side. That's the red thread for me. The red thread is held taut. I'm looping the rusty thread around it and pulling it up to the top. One more to do because we have 2 loops on each thread. And now I've finished on this side, so I'm going to leave the rusty thread there while I do the left-hand side. So we're going to pick up the rusty thread on this side, holding the yellow thread nice and taut. We loop round, and we pull the loop up to the top. We do it one more time on the yellow thread because it's 2 loops on each thread. Then we can move on to the 2nd thread on this side. That's the coral thread for me. Let's just straighten out my threads a bit. Don't want it to get wonky. So I'm looping my thread, my rusty thread around the coral thread. Then I'm going to pull that loop up to the top. One more loop to do because there are 2 loops on each thread. Pull it up to the top. And then finally on this side we have the red thread that's now in the middle. So let's loop the rusty thread around the red thread. There's the first loop done. Pull the knot up to the top, do the 2nd loop, and pull the knot up to the top. Now we have our 2 rusty threads in the middle. We're going to swap them over because every time you have to swap them over to join the 2 halves of your bracelet together. So now that we've finished one complete band of 4 on the friendship bracelets, I'm going to speed this up now because we're just going to do exactly the same thing again. So we're going to start working a 2nd row in the same colours, so we're starting with the yellow here. So the main things to remember with your friendship bracelets are you want to keep your kind of different halves of the bracelet separate so that we've got our 4 threads on each side and we know which half is which half. And it's a mirror image, so you know you've always got the 2 yellows, say, on the outside, then working towards the centre. It's like you've got a mirror down the middle, so the colours go from one side out to the other. And something that is easy to forget is that you're doing 2 knots on each thread, and that's what gives you the nice smooth friendship bracelet. If you just do 1, you can end up with a bit of a curly bracelet, which can be harder to keep under control. And something else that's very easy to forget is you don't want to forget to swap your threads over at the bottom. So when the 2 colours meet in the middle, that's your reminder to switch them so that then the 2 central colours swap to the other sides of the bracelet. If you do want to see them all step by step again, it's fine, and then you can sort of knot along with me. Just go back to the beginning of the video and we're going to do exactly the same thing again, so you can watch all the different knots. We're going to do another row of 4 bands, so if you would rather do that, you can go and watch from the beginning again, and then we'll meet up for the next section, which is going to be learning a different stitch, which is more of a wrapped knot. Now, what's great about the styles of friendship bracelets we're doing here is you can, if you want, just do a full chevron, so you could just keep going like this all the way to the end of the friendship bracelet and then just have a lovely bracelet of chevrons all the way to the end, and that would look fabulous. If you do want to do that, I would make your lengths a little bit longer because the wrap section that we're going to do in the middle uses a bit less thread. So maybe if you want to do a full chevron bracelet, I would start with 80 centimetres lengths of thread. Now we've done our 8 chevron bands, we're going to learn how to do the wrap section, which is this sort of 2 stranded twirly sections in the middle that you can see on either side of the button. And the great thing about this is that you've already learnt the kind of wrap stitch that you need to work this. It's very similar, but what we're going to do is working the two halves of the bracelet separately. We're going to grab 3 strands together and then loop the outside thread around all 3 strands, so then we're pulling our loop up to the top. And so it is the very similar to what you were doing for your chevrons. It's only that each loop will be a bit bigger because you're going around 3 threads. And rather than just doing 2 loops, we're going to do 4 in each colour. You can do more if you want. It just means you will have sort of a thicker band of yellow, it would be for us if we did more loops. But we're going to do 4 loops in each colour. So now I'm going to put the yellow in with those other strands and take out the coral. So now it's the coral that I'm wrapping around the other 3 strands. So I'm wrapping the loop around and pulling the loop up to the top. We're going to do that 4 times. This is the third time in the coral. We'll do it 1 more time in the coral, so pulling that loop of thread around all 3 and up to the top. And now we will swap the colour out. So we've already had yellow and coral, so I'm going to go with the vibrant red next. So that is going to be my separate colour. So I'm holding the other 3 strands of colour together and then looping the red thread around, pulling it through and pulling the loop up to the top. We're looping the red thread around, pulling it through, pulling up to the top. That's the second loop done. Here is the third one, pulling the red loop up to the top, and then the 4th loop of red, which we're going to pull up to the top. So there's our band of red done. So now we want the rusty colour is the only one we haven't used yet. So I'm going to gather the other 3 strands together and pull out the rusty thread, and then wrapping the rusty thread around those other 3 strands and pulling it up to the top. That's our first loop. We'll do our second loop in rusty thread, pulling it up to the top, wrapping the rusty thread around the other 3 threads, keeping those taut and pulling the rusty thread up to the top. And here's the 4th one, the last loop in the rusty thread. So now we've got our coloured bands on this side. So we're going to move over to work them on the other side of the bracelet. So it's nice to keep it symmetrical. So I would again start with the yellow, same as we did on the other side. Going to hold the other 3 strands of thread together. Then we'll loop the yellow around those other 3 strands, pulling the other 3 strands nice and taut. Pull the yellow thread up to the end. We'll do that same again for the second time. That's our second loop of yellow. The third loop of yellow, holding the other strands nice and taut, so the yellow loop pushes up to the top, and then the last yellow, the 4th one, up to the top. And so as we're mirroring the colours on the other side, the next thread we want is the coral one. So the yellow one is going back into the handful with the other 2 threads, and we're wrapping the coral thread around all those other 3 threads, pulling the loop to the top. Doing the same for a second time, and then this is the 3rd loop of coral thread that we're pulling up to the top, and then the 4th loop of coral thread around the other 3 strands of thread and pulling that loop up to the top. So there's our 4 loops done in the coral. So the next colour we want, I think it was the vibrant red, to keep it the same as on the other side. So we're going to wrap the vibrant red around the other 3 strands, pull that loop of thread up to the top, wrap the vibrant thread around the other 3 strands, pull the red loop up to the top. This is the 3rd time we're wrapping the red thread around, pulling it up to the top, and then the 4th time, and then we're pulling it up to the top. So we've now got our 3 bands of colour. We need 1 more, it's the rusty thread for me, so we're separating that out, holding the other 3 colours together, looping the rusty thread around the other 3, pulling it up to the top, that's the first one, looping the rusty thread around the 3, pulling it up, number 2, wrapping the rusty thread around the other 3 colours, then keeping the other 3 colours taut, we're pulling the loop up to the top, that's the 3rd one, so there's the 4th loop of rusty thread, we're pulling up to the top. So it gives you this nice sort of twisted band structure, and you get a nice twirl as the knots turn around the bracelet as well. And what we're going to try now is we're going to add a button to the centre of our bracelet. This is a nice coconut button, and what you want to do is find one that has 4 holes in. That means that it will lie nice and flat. I did think about maybe you could use a charm, or I've got this little bell left over from my Easter chocolate, but no, I've decided that I'm going to use a button with 4 holes. I like the idea of a coconut button. So I'm going to take one of my cottons. I've gone for the yellow one, and I'm going to thread that through one of the holes. This can be a bit fiddly, so it helps if you can dampen the thread, because that helps, sort of keeps it nice and together and a bit straighter. So we're going to thread the yellow thread through one of the holes. Sometimes it's easier to just put the thread in your mouth. Then we will, oh yes, okay, so we're threading it through, that's done it. We've got it through one of the holes of the button. And then it's gone through one hole, and then you want to put it back into the button through the hole sort of underneath it. So it's almost like you're stitching one of your colours through, and that's going to hold the button nice and securely on our friendship bracelet on this side. And so we're going to do the same with one of the colours from the other side. I quite like to mix the colours up, because then you get little bursts of colour on your button that are different. But if you want them to match, just use the same colour again. I'm switching mine out just for fun. So then I've just dampened that. I'm going to thread it through the top hole on the button, and then there's one hole left underneath, which I'll take that thread back down through, and that's going to secure our button onto our bracelet. And what's nice about having a 4-hole button is it lies nice and flat on the bracelet. If you have a 2-hole one, you can just attach it on one side, but it can get a bit flappy. So what's good about this is that button is now nice and secure, and it will be held flat when you're wearing it. And now to secure the button onto the bracelet, we're going to do it in the same way as we did to make the bands on the other side. So we'll gather our 3 strands together. We're keeping it mirrored, so we're doing the wrap again, looping a thread around, pulling it up and under. So just as we did on the other side of the button, we're going to work the wraps on each side of the bracelet, so it's 4 strands on each side, and we're going to wrap one colour around the other 3 strands. We're going to do 4 knots in each colour before switching out to another colour, and then wrapping that new colour around the other 3 strands of thread on this side. You can, if you want to, do a whole wrap bracelet in this friendship bracelet in this wrap style. It works quite well with 4 strands of thread as we're doing here, but you could just have 5 strands of thread and do the wraps around and have it as a sort of skinnier bracelet. This is good though, it's a good way if you haven't got so many threads. You can make lots more bracelets by keeping them thinner and using this wrap style. So if you've got a lot of friends to make bracelets for, you haven't got too many embroidery threads at home, do everyone one of these lovely wraps. You do get a nice twist in your thread as you wrap it around. It sort of has a nice spiral effect. But now we have finished doing our wraps on both sides. So I'm going to re-separate out my strands of thread. We're now going to learn how to work the reverse chevron. But first off, let's separate out our 2 halves of the bracelet so that they are mirrored across the middle. So I'm going to have the yellow on the outside, then I've got the coral, then the red, then the rusty colour. Now on the reverse chevron, we're going to start working from the middle this time. So the thread that you have in the middle is going to be the colour that will be first, your first band. So because we finished with the rusty thread on the other side, that's why I've got it in the middle of this time round. So you can see the reverse chevron sort of points the other way. It's pointing, they're both almost like arrows pointing in towards the button. It just again gives us a nice symmetrical finish in our friendship bracelet. So we're still going to cross our threads over as we did before. So we're going to start by crossing the 2 corals over. So they're sitting on the different halves of the friendship bracelet. And then I'm taking the first colour on that other side, for me, that one is the coral, and I'm wrapping that rusty colour around it and pulling it up. So we're going to do that twice again. It's 2 knots on each thread, 2 twists on each thread. So the first one is done. So then I'm going to move along to the second thread on this side. We're wrapping the thread around it, pulling the knot up to the top. We're doing that twice. Then we're going to do it to the final thread on this half of the friendship bracelet. It's a yellow, so we're going to wrap the thread around, keeping the yellow nice and taut. We're pulling that knot up to the top, and we're going to do that one more time because it's 2 knots on each thread. So now we've done this side, we'll go back and do the same on the other side, starting again with the thread in the middle. We've got the rusty thread which we're wrapping around, keeping the red nice and taut. Then we're pulling that knot up to the top. We're going to do that one more time because it's 2 knots on each thread. Now we're going to move along to the next one, which is the coral for me, I think. So then we're going to wrap the rusty thread around it, pull that loop up to the top. And then we're going to do the same again because it's 2 knots on each thread. We're keeping that coral thread nice and taut, pulling the rusty knot up to the top, and then the last thread on this side, the yellow for me, we're going to wrap that thread around, keep the yellow nice and taut, pull the knot up to the top, one more because it's 2 on each thread, wrapping it around, pulling the knot up to the top. So that's our first row of the reverse chevron done. So we can start our second row, which is going to be red. So we do want to start by swapping those 2 threads over. We're still swapping the threads in the middle for each row, just like we did on the regular chevron. So then we're going to take that red thread, wrap it around the coral thread, pull the red loop up to the top. Take the red thread, wrap it around the coral thread, pull the red loop up to the top. That's 2 done. So we'll move on to our next thread. So yellow for me, we're wrapping the red thread around it, pulling the red loop up to the top. Wrapping the yellow thread around, the red thread around the yellow again, pulling the loop up to the top. We've got one more thread on this side. It's the coral thread. We're going to wrap the red thread around it, pull the loop up, do it a second time because it's 2 knots on each thread. So that's this side done. So now we can go to the other side. We're starting in the middle again, picking up the red thread, wrapping it around the coral thread, pulling that loop up to the top. And we're doing that another time because it's 2 loops on each side. Then we're going to pick up the yellow thread, wrap the red thread round it, pull that loop up to the top. Do it again because it's 2 loops on each thread. And then the final thread on this side, it's the rusty thread for me. Wrap the red thread round it. Rusty thread is kept nice and taut. We pull that red thread up. Do it one more time because it's 2 loops on each thread. Now we're going to do our second row of reverse chevron. So we're swapping the 2 central colours over. It's the coral for me. So I've swapped them. Then I'm going to take that first coral, wrap it around the next colour along. It's yellow for me. Pull the loop up to the top. Wrapping the coral thread around, pulling the loop up to the top. And then we're going to move along to the next thread, which is rusty for me. Looping the coral thread around the rusty thread. Holding the rusty thread nice and taut, I'm pulling that loop up to the top. And then looping the thread, holding the wrapping thread nice and taut, the loop goes up to the top. So now we've got one more thread, the outside thread on this half of the friendship bracelet. So we're looping that thread around it. We're doing 2 knots on each thread, pulling that up to the top. So that's this side done. So now we're going to go across to the other half. We're picking up that central thread on the other half. We're going to loop it around that next thread along, keeping that next thread nice and taut. We're pulling the loop up to the top. We're going to do that one more time because it's 2 knots on each thread. Now we're going to the next colour. We're going to hold that thread nice and taut, looping the thread around, pulling the knot up to the top. Then do that again because it's 2 knots per thread. So now we have one more thread on this side. It's the red for me. So I'm looping the thread around, keeping the red nice and taut, pulling the loop up to the top. Doing it one more time because it's 2 knots on each thread. That's another row done. So now we go back to the centre and we swap over the 2 threads so that each one is on the other side. Now we're going to keep hold of one, pick up the next thread along, loop the yellow around it, keep it nice and taut, pull the yellow loop up to the top. Do it one more time because it's 2 knots on each thread. Then we pick up the next thread along, which is red for me. Gonna loop the yellow around, keep the red taut, pull the yellow up to the top. Do it for a second time. And then the last thread on this side, gonna pick it up, loop the yellow around, pull the loop up to the top. Do it for a second time, pull the loop up to the top again. And that's this half done now, so we can go back and pick up the central thread, the yellow for me. And we can do the same on the other side, so we're going to pick up the next thread along, we're going to wrap the yellow around and pull the yellow loop up to the top. Do it for a second time because it's 2 loops on each thread. Then we pick up the next thread along, we loop the yellow around, we pull the loop up to the top, and we do it again because it's 2 loops on each side. And then the final thread on this side, pick it up, we loop the yellow around, pull that loop along to the top and do it for a second time. That's our 3rd band done. So now we just have one more colour to do. So the 2 central threads, we're going to swap them over. Keep hold of one of those rusty threads, we pick up the next thread along, we loop the rusty thread around and we pull the loop up to the top. And then we do the same again for the second time because it's 2 loops per thread. Then the next one along, we pick up the next thread along. It's coral for me, we're going to loop our thread around it. And then we pull that loop up to the top and do the same again. Then we pick up the last thread on this side. We loop the thread around it, keeping the yellow thread nice and taut. We pull that loop up to the top and do it one more time because it's 2 knots on each thread. And then we're going to do the same on the other side. So we're going back to the centre, pick up the central thread on that side. It's the rusty again. We loop it round, pull the loop up to the top, do it for the second time. Then we pick the next thread along. We hold the coral thread taut, we loop the rusty thread around, we pull the loop up to the top. Then we do the same again because it's 2 knots on each thread. And then the last thread, the outside thread on this side, we pick it up, we loop it around, we pull the loop up to the top. One more time, loop up to the top. So now we've done the reverse chevron in all 4 colours. So we're going to do exactly the same again. We want another block of reverse chevrons in the 4 colours of our bracelet. So if you want to knot along with me, go back to the section just below the button. We're going to do exactly the same thing again. Just remember, make sure to swap your threads just because it's a reverse section and you're starting in the middle. It can be easy to forget. You want to swap your threads in the middle every time. And you're doing 2 knots per thread. And once you've completed your second block of 4 colours in the reverse chevron, you're at about the right length for a child's bracelet. You can make it longer just by doing more blocks or more repeats in each colour, but we think this is a good size to make if you're giving it to a child to wear. Once our bracelet is the length we want it to be, you just need to tie a knot in the other end. So undo if it's attached, if you've got it safety pinned to your jeans, undo your safety pin, then just gather all the threads together and then tie a knot in all the threads. You want to try and get the knot as close to the end of your friendship bracelet as you can. So if you make it a bit loose and then kind of pull it down towards, and of course you should be very good at pulling knots along thread now. So I'm sure you'll all have lovely, nice, neat ends. And sometimes it's good to keep the length long because it helps when the person is tying it onto themselves, and then they can just trim off the spare thread once they've tied it onto their wrists. And the habit is you wear your bracelet until it falls off and then you make a wish. So I hope that you have enjoyed making these friendship bracelets, and now you know all the tips and techniques You can make them for all your friends.